Imagine a future where a single country controls the chips inside every phone, the brains of autonomous vehicles, the networks connecting our devices, and the atoms used to encrypt our secrets. This scenario is not science fiction. It is what I call the tech war. In this contest, the country that leads in critical technologies like semiconductors, artificial intelligence, advanced communications, 5G and 6G, quantum computing, biotech, electric vehicles, EVs, batteries, and high-end manufacturing will shape global supply chains and wield tremendous geopolitical influence. This competition is about more than gadgets. Whoever dominates these technologies will influence jobs, national security, privacy, the environment, and the balance of global power. The technologies of tomorrow will determine who controls the world's data and infrastructure. They will decide which countries are self-sufficient and which must depend on foreign tech. A nation that can dominate chips, AI, or quantum technologies could paralyze an opponent's economy by cutting off supply chains or by breaking encrypted communications. As a consumer, I feel these impacts every day, from the price of my smartphone to the privacy of my personal data. During the 1990s and early 2000s, US firms moved much of their manufacturing to China. American companies provided the designs and core technologies. Chinese factories provided low-cost labor and massive scale. This partnership built global supply chains, but also gave China a strong manufacturing base. Beijing was not content with remaining the world's assembly line. In 2015, it launched Made in China 2025, a 10-year industrial strategy to achieve self-sufficiency in critical technologies like robotics, high-end machine tools, power generation equipment, and electric vehicles. The plan set ambitious targets to raise the domestic content of core components to 40% by 2020 and 70% by 2025. Although some sectors improved, new energy vehicles reached a domestic market share above 50% by 2024, and power generation equipment reached its goals. Most high-end equipment targets were only partly achieved or not met at all. For example, China still relies on imported lithography machines, jet engines, and high-end machine tools. The US responded belatedly. Under the Trump administration, Washington imposed tariffs on Chinese goods and introduced export controls on advanced chips. In 2022, it passed the CHIPS and Science Act, promising tens of billions of dollars in subsidies to build domestic chip fabs and fund research. But these moves came after China had spent hundreds of billions of dollars on its technology ambitions over more than a decade. The US was also distracted by wars abroad. According to Brown University's Costs of War project, the US has appropriated and is obligated to spend about $8 trillion on the post-9/11 wars, including $2.3 trillion for active operations and over $1 trillion in interest because the wars were financed through debt. Between 2003 and 2023, the US spent and obligated over $2.89 trillion on wars in Iraq and Syria. Semiconductors power everything from smartphones and cloud servers to fighter jets and AI models. US companies still dominate chip design. Firms like NVIDIA, AMD, Qualcomm, Apple, and Broadcom create most of the world's high-performance processors. Market analysis shows that NVIDIA effectively monopolizes the cloud AI hardware market because most cloud providers offer only NVIDIA GPUs. However, the US offshored much of its chip fabrication. Today, Taiwan's TSMC and South Korea's Samsung produce most leading-edge chips, while only a small share of chips are manufactured on US soil. China's weakness lies in cutting-edge fabrication. Chinese chip fabs lag roughly 5 years behind global leaders and depend on imported lithography machines and design tools. Yet Beijing is catching up by pumping at least $150 billion into the semiconductor sector through programs such as the National Integrated Circuit Plan and the big fund Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation. SMIC, produced 7-nanometer chips using older lithography, an impressive feat, although yields remain low. China is also investing heavily in legacy chips for cars and appliances to secure its supply chains. While the US is rebuilding domestic fabs through the CHIPS Act, those plants will take years to come online. I often hear that data is the new oil. With 1.4 billion people and large government surveillance systems, China generates enormous data pools to train AI models. Beijing uses industrial policy to push AI development across the entire stack, from funding domestic chip production to subsidizing cloud computing and AI applications. The RAND Corporation noted in 2024 that China aims to become the global AI leader by 2030 and deploys pilot zones and research hubs to support this goal.
As a result, Chinese companies are strong in applied AI. Facial recognition, fintech, drones, and social credit systems are pervasive. Chinese research institutions publish more AI papers than any other country, and domestic large language models like Qwen, Alibaba, and ChatGLM are closing the performance gap with US models. The US retains a lead in frontier AI models. Labs like OpenAI, GPT-4, Google DeepMind, Gemini, Anthropic, Claude 3, and Microsoft produce state-of-the-art systems. Still, US companies struggle to scale manufacturing and integrate AI into industry. Export controls on AI chips limit China's access to advanced GPUs, but they also encourage China to develop domestic alternatives. The US faces a talent shortage. Many AI PhD graduates are foreign nationals who may return to China or other countries. Modern networks are another battleground. Chinese firm Huawei has become one of the largest suppliers of 5G equipment and smartphones, though Western governments worry it could enable espionage. Consequently, the US, Australia, Japan, and others restricted Huawei gear, while Huawei remains a key supplier in many developing countries. China continues to build the world's largest 5G network. By October 2025, it had constructed around 4.76 million 5G base stations, and 5G users exceeded 1.18 billion, according to China's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. Earlier in June 2025, China also led the world in 6G patent applications, holding about 40.3% of the global total, and owning about 60% of global AI patents. This large patent portfolio gives Beijing influence over future communication standards and ensures that 6G development aligns with Chinese technologies. Quantum technology could revolutionize encryption and computing. China invests heavily in quantum research, about $15 billion in government funding. It's built the world's largest quantum communication network, spanning 12,000 kilometers and linking more than 150 industrial users via fiber and 2 quantum satellites. In March 2025, Chinese and South African scientists extended a satellite-based quantum link to 12,900 kilometers, connecting the 2 continents. China already operates a 2,000-kilometer terrestrial quantum network between Beijing and Shanghai. These networks enable ultra-secure communications that are almost impossible to intercept. While US companies like IBM and Google lead in quantum computing hardware, commercial systems remain years away. If China masters quantum communication first, it could protect its own communications and potentially compromise those of rivals. China's dominance in EVs and batteries is dramatic. In 2024, Chinese automakers sold 11.3 million electric vehicles, and EVs made up 48% of China's passenger vehicle market, compared with about 10% in the US. A 2025 analysis by the Centre for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, reports that 6 of the world's top 10 EV manufacturers are Chinese. BYD has overtaken Tesla as the largest EV seller, and China produces over 60% of all EVs globally. Chinese firms CATL and BYD control almost half of global battery production, with market shares of roughly 37.9% and 17.2%. China produces more than 75% of lithium-ion battery cells, about 70% of cathodes, and 85% of anodes. It also refines more than 60% of lithium and about 70% of cobalt, giving Beijing a chokehold on essential minerals.
These achievements stem from massive government support. Between 2009 and 2023, China provided roughly $230 billion in subsidies to the EV industry, including rebates, tax breaks, R&D programs, and infrastructure investment. The strategy paid off. Chinese EV companies are roughly 30% faster at developing and releasing new models than legacy car makers and account for about 65% of high-impact research publications on battery science. China's domestic market accounts for more than half of global EV sales, and exports surged 851% between 2020 and 2023. While U.S. automakers are pivoting back to hybrids, China is producing $10,000 electric cars and dominating supply chains. China's dominance extends beyond EVs. It manufactures more than half of all electronics globally and is central to the production of smartphones, computers, and consumer goods. Recreating this dense manufacturing ecosystem elsewhere could take decades. China also refines the bulk of critical minerals, processing 60 to 90% of lithium, manganese, graphite, and rare earths, and about 80% of cobalt. In response to China's rise, the U.S. imposed export controls on advanced chips, AI hardware, and telecommunications equipment. Firms like Huawei were banned from U.S. networks, and Chinese entities lost access to cutting-edge U.S. semiconductors. These measures slowed some Chinese companies, but also pushed them to develop domestic alternatives. China retaliated by imposing export controls on minerals like graphite, reminding the world of its leverage over critical materials. The U.S. relies on alliances with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Netherlands, and others for chip production and equipment. These partners host key fabs, TSMC, Samsung, and companies like ASML, Extreme Ultraviolet Lithography. The CHIPS Act offers incentives for TSMC and Samsung to build factories in Arizona and Texas. China, meanwhile, extends its influence through the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and the Digital Silk Road. According to Merix, Chinese firms and state banks have financed more than $17 billion in digital projects abroad, including about $7 billion in loans and FDI for fiber optic and telecom projects, and over $10 billion for e-commerce and mobile payment deals. Huawei, ZTE, Alibaba, and other companies build 5G networks, data centers, and mobile payment systems across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, exporting Chinese standards and deepening dependence on Chinese technology. Apps like TikTok, Shein, and Alipay give China cultural and economic influence around the globe. Critics argue that the U.S. squandered its manufacturing base and allowed China to catch up. Over the past 3 decades, many U.S. factories closed as firms chased low-cost labor overseas. Once factories and supply chains left, so did the know-how. Building a new semiconductor fab in the U.S. requires complex permitting, environmental reviews, and coordination across multiple levels of government. China's centralized system can clear land and build industrial parks quickly. Chinese firms scale technology rapidly because of the huge domestic market. When the new product launches, it can be tested by millions of users almost instantly. U.S. companies must navigate antitrust concerns and investor scrutiny. The US and China may decouple further. 2 separate technology ecosystems could emerge, forcing countries to choose between US and Chinese networks, chips, and platforms. Standards might diverge, with one half of the world using Huawei ZTE equipment and Chinese AI models, and the other half using Western technology. This fragmentation could create inefficiencies, but prevent any single power from dominating globally. Both countries may increase domestic investment. The US could use the CHIPS Act to rebuild manufacturing and invest in quantum and AI, while China continues to subsidize and leapfrog. Competition might spur innovation on both sides. Advances in quantum computing could threaten current encryption. Nations will scramble to build quantum-resistant encryption and secure communication networks. AI will be weaponized in cyber warfare and propaganda. Despite rivalry, the two economies might remain intertwined. Global challenges such as climate change and pandemics could force cooperation in certain tech areas, green tech and health. Dual-use technologies may be jointly governed to avoid accidents. This tech war is more than a contest between Beijing and Washington. It is a battle over the future architecture of the global economy. China, once seen as a low-cost manufacturer, now aspires to lead in every critical technology. It invests heavily, scales quickly, and builds supply chains that are difficult to replicate. The US, once the undisputed technology leader, still holds major advantages in innovation, design, and alliances, but has allowed manufacturing and mineral supply chains to erode. Whether the US is truly losing depends on how we define victory. If leadership is measured by factory output, China is ahead in electric vehicles, batteries, rare earth processing, and telecommunications. If leadership is measured by cutting-edge innovation and disruptive breakthroughs, the US remains at the frontier of AI and chip design.